Welcome to today's webinar, a conversation with the co-chairs of our fall conference on the urgent issues facing Canada. My name is Andrew Cardozo. I'm president of the Pearson Centre, and I will moderate the discussion today. I want to start by recognizing that the Pearson Centre is headquartered on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, and the speakers and audience who are welcome to join us from across Turtle Island. As you may know, the Pearson Centre, established almost 10 years ago, is a progressive think tank that brings together a wide cross-section of Canadians from all political parties, from business, labor, civil society, and from all backgrounds to address the challenging economic and social issues facing Canada. It is perhaps the only think tank which regularly hosts MPs from all political parties. Our favorite slogan is, "We bring people and ideas together." A special thank you to the donors and sponsors who make this kind of event possible. And if you would like to make a donation, feel free to visit thepearsoncentre.ca and make a donation so that more of these thoughtful sessions can take place. Just briefly on the format, I will have several questions for our panel for the next 45 minutes or so, and then we will take questions from you, the audience. So please send questions in on the question box on your screen, and we'll get to as many as we can. We will end promptly at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. We held one pre-conference roundtable in Vancouver on November the 9th on the subject of supply chain challenges, which was attended by MPs from all parties, and that report will be up on our website shortly. Today, I'm delighted to introduce this very impressive panel to start the online part of the conference. So the three co-chairs. Professor Kahente Horn-Miller is Assistant Vice President and for Indigenous Teaching, Learning and Research at Carleton University, and is an Associate Professor in the School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies. Her areas of specialties include Indigenous women, identity politics, colonization, and Indigenous governance. Linda Silas is President of the Canadian Federation of Nurses Unions, the voices of nearly 250,000 unionized nurses and nursing students across the country. She is indeed one of the most experienced and respected national union leaders in Canada. Brian Gallant is our third co-chair. He's not able to join us today because he's a very brand new parent and had other priorities today, but we'll see him later in the week. He is, I just want to tell you, he's the CEO of Space Canada, which represents Canada's space innovators and allied industries to highlight the strategic global new space economy. He's, of course, the former Premier of New Brunswick and is an advisory board member of the Pearson Centre. So to all of you three as co-chairs, thank you for doing this. Linda and Kahente, welcome back to our podium. Our fourth panelist, and actually third today, is Professor Jonathan Calof. He's a board member and hence a host with me of today's member. He's a board member of the Pearson Centre and the brain trust of our organization. He's heading up the strategic planning effort currently underway. I should tell you he's co-chair of the UNESCO Anticipatory Systems for Innovation and New Venture Creation. He's a much published and much awarded professor at the Telfer School of Management at the University of Ottawa. So welcome all three of you. Let me start with canvassing you for what you think are the urgent issues these days facing Canada. And perhaps Linda Silas, I will start with you. What do you feel are the urgent issues that society and government should be dealing with?
Thank you, and thank you, Andrew, and the organization for inviting me. First, and you acknowledge Turtle Island. I'm on the other end. I'm in Newfoundland, Labrador, the beautiful land of the Bikhtawak people and Mi'kmaq people. And you know, there's so many. The list is so long. I have a 33-year-old son, and he reminds me every day, climate, Mom, jobs, good jobs, Mom. What are we going to do about housing, Mom? What are we going to do about pensions in 40 years? And, you know, when I look at climate, it used to be a big, big picture. I would spend my time between Ottawa and New Brunswick. In the last 10 years, Ottawa is being hit with 3 major hurricanes that have just hit near my house. And in New Brunswick, the last 10 years, Fiona, which hit my house, Teddy, which hit my house, Dorian, which hits my house. And you're looking all of that and saying we all have to talk about climate. The economy, well, the economy is based on people not being able to buy food, not to be able to get good jobs, having to have 2 or 3 jobs, and not to be able to put a roof over their head. That's the discussions we should be having. And I know you're going to bring back healthcare, so I'll save my 2 cents on the crisis in healthcare when we get to that topic. But it is a topic we all have to give attention to.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. Professor Horn-Miller, what are your thoughts about the urgent issues that we face today?
Well, I can certainly agree completely with Linda's long list, and I'll add to that, I would say education, ensuring that students can afford education, that have access to education, and that not only it includes post-secondary, but also when we think about elementary and high school level children, the kind of education that they're getting, as well as the kind of support for neurodiverse children, right? I have a child who is autistic, and I spend a lot of time advocating for the right kind of supports, and letting the education, the school know exactly, what I think that he needs, and drawing it out. But that shouldn't have to be that. I mean, it's partially my duty as a mother, but also, I think that more support is needed for teachers in schools, because we're seeing more and more. We're seeing. I remember growing up and never hearing the word autism, never hearing, about those issues, and now it's children are like that all over the place. So supporting them as well and enabling them to be integrated into the school system in a way that is productive. As well, of course, climate change. As Indigenous folks, we're paying attention to this. One of the things that I think is important is, and this is what I do in the classroom, is teaching students how to engage with each other, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, learning how to talk to each other. And I think, throughout all of society, that's something that has to be brought forward, is how can we stop fighting on these issues, and seeing the relevance, and just learning the very basics of how to engage, how to talk, how to share ideas, knowledge, because Indigenous folks, we have a lot of knowledge about what to do about not resolving the climate issue, but in certainly surviving it, shall we say. So I'm just going to add.
Yeah. And do you think we've lost our ability to communicate, or has our ability to communicate been affected during COVID, when we all stayed at home and apart so much?
Oh, I would say, we saw that, we've seen that for a long time. The ability to communicate, we're doing it right now, right? We're online, we're talking to each other, but when it's very different when you're in person and in face, sitting across from people, right? I look to the consensus-based decision-making process of my people, and how that engenders very much a different kind of dialogue and engagement and respect. And I think that's the key, is respectful engagement that has to be take place.
Yeah, and I particularly sorry, go ahead, Linda.
No, I just wanted to commend Gwenta in how she described it, neurodiverse. Because we put a lot of stigmas on a lot of diagnostic, and when you get baffled by the diagnostic. But neurodiverse is, we're all neurodiverse when you think about it. And even before all these diagnostic, we had the hypers and those who were slower in the schools. We just didn't have the support system around it. So congrats.
Yeah, and I worry about kids who are now about 3 or 4 years old. They grow up without playing with other kids for 3 or 4 years, for the first few years of their lives. That's, I shouldn't laugh. It's just mind-boggling as to how scary that would be. Professor Calof, your thoughts about the urgent issues?
So I'm going to start off by saying, these two are a tough act to follow, and I think we're going to agree with each other more than we're going to disagree. But as a professor, Andrew, you know me, I can't give a straight answer. So I'm going to break my list down into the current challenges that we got to deal with now and the grand challenges that will bite us in the you-know-what 5, 10, 15 years from now if we don't start dealing with it now. Put a different way, and I love I'm a father, I'm a grandfather, so I loved how you were integrating that in. The grand challenges of the future is the world I worry about for my children and my grandchildren, okay? And that drives me. The challenges today is the world I deal with as I try to raise my children and integrate in society. Now, as parents, we try to inculcate some core values in our children. I think we're all consistent. We say, treat everybody like you would like to be treated. And Kahente, you were right about respect for each other, integrating what others have to say. We say a society takes care of their sick, it takes care of its poor. They're core values. And I'm afraid to say we're failing. Let's be very clear. Gaja, I loved when you brought up this communication integration. But right now, anti-Semitism is rising dramatically. Islamophobia is rising. We're not doing a good job on reconciliation as far as I'm concerned. So how do I say to my children, treat others like you want to be treated when we're not doing it now? How do I say take care of the sick? And Linda, you'll talk more about this. When, I talked about it beforehand, I spent 4 months in hospital fighting leukemia. These angels, these absolute angels, these nurses, battling in an environment that is not conducive, not being given the power to do things that I know they can do in this broken system. We say take care of the poor. You're right. We don't have affordable housing. That is an issue. My son, who's in Toronto, 2-income family, they can't afford a house. Imagine what others who don't have that income are facing right now. So how are we taking care of our poor? How's about the fact that you want to add health and taking care, that we couldn't get children's Tylenol and Advil? We have to bring it in from outside. I'm not sure if that is a supply chain problem, which we know we're having problems getting food and we're having problems getting drugs to deal with our people. So that becomes a bit of a problem. And then when I look at the longer term, and I'm going to drag Andrew into this one, we're seeing things today that if left unchecked and undealt with are really going to hurt in the future. Linda, and Ganja, you brought up the climate change. That is a current issue, but is going to bite us even worse. And we've been talking about this for 15, 20 years. I just think about the government policies. We have the issue of the economy. Okay, we look at it in terms of the problems today, but I look at it in terms of grand challenges. 73% of our exports go to the United States, 4 or 5% to China. We've been saying for 20 years, we got to decrease our reliance on one country, otherwise we're in trouble. And we certainly saw that when it was time to do negotiations with the United States on the agreement. We are entirely overdependent. Play that one through. By the way, that's complex because that also involves tying immigration policy in with countries that we want to go to. That's a grand challenge. Grand challenge. You mentioned about jobs. Andrew will talk more about this, but when he was president of the Alliance for Sector Councils, we set up an early warning system that said, where are jobs going to be in the future? How many kids are in school with that now? What programs exist, and how's immigration being tied in? And something, for example, as minor as masonry. Algonquin College had to close their program because there were no students. Yet we have this huge, huge need for masonry all across Canada. It's a trade that's required. Kids aren't in the program. At the same time, we have an aging of society, which means there are now more jobs for fewer people that are not going into it, and jobs of tomorrow that we're not going to get. Now, I'm going to give you a quick example, and then Andrew, I'd like to talk more about the task side. When I was doing some work in Europe, they were complaining that under the EU, when they came together, kids left to go to the areas of the most opportunity. And so 10 years later, when entrepreneurs emerged in certain countries and said, I got an idea, there was no labor. there was no skills. They were off somewhere else. So if we don't get that education part down, that immigration part down, if we don't get the school part down, then those jobs of tomorrow will not be going here, and those industries of tomorrow are not going to be here, and the industries of today might not have employees. And Andrew, you might want to talk a bit about what we found in mining and in agriculture.
Well, I might come back to that, but if you don't mind, I just want to well, touch base. I'll say generally speaking is what you mentioned, which is the rapidly aging society means there are a lot of professions across the board which are short of people. And one of the things that happened with COVID was that while we knew that there's all these people in their 60s who are going to be retiring, and we thought the graph would go gradually down over 10 to 15 years. In fact, I shouldn't say gradually, fairly precipitously down in 10 to 15 years. With COVID, it just went down really fast in 2 years. And so a whole lot of people have left the workforce, and that's caused a lot of shortages all throughout. I want to shift a little bit and talk about how we keep track of so much that is going on in our society. And Kahente, I might ask you to talk about how you find it with young people and your students. How do they, what are they thinking about all the different issues that are happening around them, and how do they see their future? It might be scary for most people, I would think.
I think students are questioning, what am I going to do with this education? They're there, some are there because parents say you have to be there. Others are there because they see, well, maybe I can apply this later on. But in terms of knowledge about the larger issues that are going on, I was actually guest lecturing in a class last week, and I was very surprised. These were I think there was a couple postdocs in the class. There was some PhD students, and I was very surprised to learn that they knew very little about residential schools.
Yeah.
After everything that has gone on since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So that tells me something. Tells me that more work needs to be done. In terms of the larger issues, it's small pockets of students that choose to be socially aware, right? And that takes, I think on the part of families, really. I mean, as you know, my family is very socially aware, social justice aware, especially around Indigenous issues, but we do pay attention to what is going on within the larger context, nationally and internationally. And we talk about this. This is something that is within our conversations around the table. But is that happening in every house? I think not. I think that I know that my neighbor down the road is more concerned about putting food on the table and getting kids to the practice, the hockey practice, or the soccer practice, the swim practice, or getting home from work and making supper. There's just so much going on in the daily lives. I think a lot of people just are tuned out. And so the question is, as educators within post-secondary institutions, we have a responsibility to bring, I think, those things back in. I often use them as case studies, right? To bring in the larger issues around you, point things out, and tell the students, okay, have a look, think about this, and then I tie it into whatever the lecture's about as a way to kind of help them see the larger relevance of it. But I mean, that's me, and that's my responsibility. But for a large part, I think people are, in a way, are tuned out.
Yeah, I mean, and if you just take the issue of reconciliation a little further, I'm saddened but not surprised that so many students don't know much about residential schools. And I think when the unmarked graves came to light, the 215, there was this great awareness, but then we just move on after that, as we do with all sorts of crises and issues. How do we get Canadians at large to be discussing reconciliation and the history of residential schools and Indigenous peoples? I remember a little while ago finding a book about Toronto And there was this map from about the 1700s where they were giving, or 1800s, they were giving land grants to people from Britain in Toronto, prime land. At the same time, then that land was being taken away from Indigenous people. And so a century later, you wonder why there's inequality in our society. How do we get people to understand that history and how it affects us today?
Well, there's I've been around for a while. I remember the 90s. I remember RCAP. I remember the commissioners traveling around to different Indigenous communities. They came to Kahnawake, and at that time, it was the very early stages of the internet, right? And so how did people share information? It was through either fax machines, telephone, or by the larger media. And so the larger media got to choose what was relevant. As a result, you have over 400 recommendations made by RCAP. Nobody seems to remember what those are. They're not in the conscious. But then you move ahead and you go to the TRC and you see there was online events, the use of social media to bring forward these things, these issues into the everyday. And as you know, I am of that generation where we're using social media. The younger people are of that generation using social media to forward these ideas and keep them in the consciousness. And I think that's one way as well, taking it upon ourselves as post-secondary educators to do what we're doing, bring it forward, get these students to talk about things and engage in these things.
Linda, let me ask you about your thoughts about how we get people to understand the complexity of all the issues we're dealing with. And I maybe you can start with the healthcare system and just talk about how you get people to understand the crisis that is faced in the, apart from talking about the crisis itself, we can just talk about the communications of it. People are aware of that situation when they are personally confronted with the shortages in the system. But if they're not there, then they just sort of close their ears and don't pay attention. Am I right?
Yeah. Yes, and when I was listening to the comments, I was thinking, okay, am I the only optimist in the room? We as a collective, as a society, we have a very short memory. You just talked about the Indigenous reports in the 1990s. Let's go to 2001, the Romano report. Most people wouldn't remember the transformation that was tried to be proposed there for healthcare. And where I have hope is with youth. Even if they're struggling for jobs, for housing, for making sure that we'll have a healthcare system in the future, they're in tune. And maybe it's the youth that I work with within the union movement, but they're showing us. They're making sure that we talk about Indigenous health, that we talk about education, that we talk about equity, fairness for everyone, climate. They're reminding us as leaders, never mind one day I want your job, but when I want your job, I don't want you to have muffed it all up before I get there. So the message that we have, that I give every day, is to use your voice. And we forget, we're so constrained as nurses with our professional responsibility, and we wear that like it's a heavy cape. We can't speak because we might divulge a secret of healthcare. And I say, break that cape away. Speak up and speak your truth and tell politicians and others what's happening in the system, because that's how we will help our patients. That's how we will help the system. But it goes out for any cause. We have to speak out. If we just let somebody else make the decisions for us, honestly, we have nothing to blame. And that's a lesson I'm learning more and more from our youth activists, where, well, Linda, you don't always have to be in a boardroom. You can be in a community and make as much change. And that is so important. And it's how do we all take those communities and build it back into the province, the country we want, the world we want.
Yeah. Jonathan, your thoughts about what are you hearing from your students in terms of their concerns about the future?
Well, we've just heard about the cynicism of old age and the optimism of the youth, and I do agree. I am so impressed at the way my students pick a cause and fight it hard. It's very idealistic, but unquestionably with emotion, They do it with their time. They do it with their money. They'll say, I'm not going to buy a product that comes from a company that engages in these behaviors. They go to the university and say, we don't want you doing investments. They are passionate more and more. So I do have a lot of respect for the youth. They know how to organize quickly, much quicker than we did. So they're okay. They know exactly how to set up the hashtags, how to set up the groups, and get 150 people out to a march. And I got to tell you, when you get a lot of people out to a march, people notice. We've seen governments go, holy crap, I didn't realize there were that many people opposed to this. But here's the but, and this but is for the people that are carrying these causes in their heart. There's only limited bandwidth. And it's upon us to either recognize what is of high priority to my students, and we know it's of high. Imagine you and I could sit down over a drink and we'd be able to put our top list of what's bothering our students, and then start look at, if my issue is not on that top 10, how do I get it on their top 10? But too many organizations with very good causes. I mean, I plot all of them and we came up with our list of challenges that's far too big. There's no bandwidth to deal with all of those at once. The percentage of students that are activists is going up, but it's still not a huge amount that would allow us to tackle that many issues. And finally, you know, Ganja, you're right. I mean, what are our students dealing with right now? We have a reading week in October to deal with the depression and the suicides. Like, we're dealing with some very major medical, social situations. They're worried about their future.
Yeah.
You got to see what Nortel's failure did my students in those days about, well, even if I have a pension, am I ever going to get my pension? They've got some legit concerns. And by the way, and you mentioned about COVID, here were the concerns my students raised during COVID. How are we going to date? How do we find a future spouse when we can't go and meet them? That, Andrew, you talked about the kids socializing. Holy crap, that's where I met my wife.
Yeah. Important issues. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the growth of populism and polarization in Canada. And certainly we've seen it more graphically in the United States, but it's certainly seeping into Canada. And this week we've got the, I guess, the fourth or fifth week of the Commission of Inquiry on the occupation of Ottawa, the convoy trip. I wonder if you can share your thoughts about what's happening with populism and polarization and how we respond to it. Linda, I might start with you. You're in the union movement. The union movement is often at the forefront of these issues, but at the same time, there are union members who may be union members, and we think of union members as being more left-wing, but some are quite a bit more right-wing these days. May not be in your union in nursing, but in some of the areas.
You want to see my anti-vaxxers writing notes to me? You know, and that's what scares me the most, is the polarization of society or groups. And it's almost you forget the middle ground. And I think you will bring us a good balance of it, because it is scary, and that's a danger of social media. It's too quick. You don't have to think. You know, click, 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 poof, it's gone. Click, 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 poof, it's gone. And we're missing, and COVID didn't help. The fact we were in our living rooms or in our kitchens all by yourself, thinking and reading all that crap that could come up all the time, and you wanted to get into it, and you forgot it was real life. It wasn't a TV show. It was real life that you were interjecting your negative comments. And now we're dealing with the mental health issues, which are scary. But that's what scares me the most. With unions, yes, of course, you know, we think and we know we're right all the time. But it is a movement that does meet with all levels of government. You know, that's one reason you invited me here, and you invited other labor leaders here too. We participate in all discussions to try to influence the agenda. We do need the movement to keep workers and societies and communities up front and living well, but we have to be at every table and discussing it. But when you're too polarized, that's scary.
Yeah, So COVID played a big role
Oh,
in increasing polarization.
I've never, and it's not to brag, but I never got hate mail before the second year of COVID.
Really?
And I've been a union leader for close to 30 years, and I had many anti-everything campaign attached to my name. And the vaccination and the maxing, wearing a mask was a tipping point that really got people not thinking, because it's based on science. It's, you know, and we were into a pandemic. So that's very hard. And I'm sure after this show, I'll be getting more on why did they even put you on it, because I'm pro-vaccination for COVID, and I'm pro-maxing when you're in public indoor area. I say that on every tribune. We are not out of it. We need to protect ourselves and protect the sick. There's people walking around that looks healthy out there, but they need our protection, just like those little kids.
Right.
That's my public announcement for the day.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Jonathan, your thoughts about populism and polarization?
All right. Many years ago, we were having a discussion as to what is Canadian culture. And that was an interesting question. And I said, Canadians, we integrate well, we help our fellow man. I said, that is a common thing that binds us together many years ago. Well, we looked at the States and said, thank God we're not doing what they're doing, especially our politicians. They get along and they work together. Holy crap. Every time we say we're not going to get polarized like we see in the States, I ask you to look at what the politicians are doing now. I ask you to think about what Linda just said about the anti-vaxxers, vaxxers within, Linda, the same families. We saw this within families where right now we've got some friends that are no longer talking to each other because they were that polarized in it. So issues that are becoming more important, for God knows what reason, we've ditched our Canadian let's listen and get along, and we're moving more and more towards polarization and not listening to each other, which is when I turned to, Ganja, and I loved your story at the beginning. Clearly your community has a communication mechanism, a respect mechanism, and have for so many years, that needs to be ported to the rest of Canada, because it's only getting worse. It's not getting better.
Kahente, go ahead, please.
I'm invited often into the government sector to talk about consensus-based decision-making and to share in how to do it properly. But I don't see it being taken up. I think it's something that is outside of the realm of thinking. How do we make this possible? The society, the structures in place are not built to enable that kind of dialogue that has to happen, and that would engender, respectful discussions, respectful dialogue. So I teach it to my students in the classroom. I say, this is what I'd like you to leave the university with. If there's one thing you're going to remember how to do, alongside writing papers and citing, journal articles, I'd like you to know how to talk to each other using consensus-based decision-making, because it can be applied anywhere you go. But, taking that as an inspiration for the kind of dialogue, the kind of discussions that we do need to have in the wider setting of Canada, I think is really important. I mean, Indigenous folks, we're sitting back all the time and we're watching what's going on and saying, man, you guys got to learn how to talk to each other. You just got to learn how to engage with each other. Look each other in the eye and say, I respect your voice, you respect mine, let's have a really good discussion here. Which is why I like the forum that we're in right now. We're having that, right? We're listening to each other. We're not cutting each other off and trying to have our say. We're actually listening to each other and responding to each other. And that's where I think it starts.
Okay, I want to remind the audience that we are happy to take your questions. So if you send your questions in on the question box that's at the bottom of your screen, we'll get to those in a few minutes, and we'll get to as many as we can. Can I talk a little bit about healthcare that we ought to be doing, and we will do a fuller show on this in a few days. But Linda, just briefly start us off on why have we got a bigger crisis than we had 3 or 4 years ago today? It seems like it's just spinning out of control.
Yes, what COVID did, they just tore the Band-Aid off. We were talking about lack of primary health care before COVID. We were talking about lack of home care, lack of mental health. We were predicting shortages in nursing and other healthcare professions. We knew all that, but all of a sudden COVID arrived and it peeled the Band-Aid off. And one thing to get also to give credit to what Gallant just said, we don't take the time to talk. You know, we're like this little wheel, a little mouse in the wheel, and we're running. And that's what we're doing with healthcare now. You know, I feel for all the premiers in this country because they are throwing solutions without thinking, throwing a bonus here, throwing another education program there. Oh, we're going to go in another country and steal their healthcare workers, and nothing is working. It's because we're not sitting down and saying, okay, we don't have enough money, don't have enough healthcare workers, and patients are suffering. It is scary what could happen. So how do we take a deep breath and sit down together with all the stakeholders and have that respect and bring the solutions and the funding to the table? I don't want to call another Romano Commission or the commissions that were called in the past before that, but I want to remind politicians we've talked about this before. We've done the solutions before, but they're just too short.
Yeah. I'm reminded of how some parts of the system do work so well, and you sort of wish things could go better everywhere. My mother was in a seniors home and had cancer for the last year of her life, and she stayed in a seniors home, and they had palliative care coming to see her. And it was just enormously wonderful to have her where she was there with people who loved her, and she didn't have to go to a palliative center where she wouldn't know anybody. And the amount of love in that place was enormous, but you knew that all those personal support workers were just about getting minimum wage or a touch over that. And yet they, you know, the line I use sometimes is that they served everybody. They rarely call them by their names, but they called them love and darling and dear day in and day out. And it was just such a beautiful experience for all of us to be part of, which you just have this voice in the back of your head going, damn, they just paid so little. It's criminal.
Paid so little and no respect. They do think you know, the big they, some employers, not all, you know, we have great employers across this country, but some believe that they are just disposable. They believe nurses are just disposable, even if the salary of a nurse is higher than a personal care worker. And we saw that at the beginning of the pandemic. It was scary and embarrassing that we had to fight for personal protective equipment. And if a nurse had to fight for it, imagine the personal care worker, they weren't getting anything. Yeah. So again, it's a thinking of people in healthcare, workers in healthcare are martyrs of healthcare. They will be there regardless. And what you're seeing today, and we'll talk about it in your next forum, is they're not there. 1 in 2 nurses want to change job. In Saskatchewan, British Columbia, Newfoundland, Labrador, it's 60% want to say, I've had enough, I want to do something else. Yeah. That is a red alert.
Very scary, yeah. Kahente, there is a long list of issues we need to be dealing with in terms of reconciliation. And I hate to say one of the top 2 or 3 priorities, but where do you think we need to be focusing now? Or where do you have hope that we're going to focus now?
Where do I have hope that we're going to focus right now? I think that, you know, I've seen, I look around my university, Carleton University, and I engage on the issues of reconciliation all the time. We put together our own calls to action and began implementing them in 2019. And I think that one of the things that has worked to enhance the awareness of the issues has been the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its outcomes. their calls to action really brought things to the forefront, really brought things, you know, despite what I said earlier about students coming in and not knowing anything about, you know, the residential school experience. I think for the larger part, the institution, those who work within Carleton University have an awareness. And I think that is because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So the one thing, and I see hope that, you know, in response, Canadians are trying to do things. But the one thing that is stopping people is the know-how. So there's a want, there's a will, there's this desire to make change, to address these issues, to address the intergenerational trauma. But it's this helpless feeling of, where do I start? Where do I begin, right? And I know this because I was at, I went to the Kent Monkman show at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto about a month ago. And I was sitting there looking at one of the paintings, and behind me I could hear two women talking. There was a group of, you know, former professors, I guess women that had worked at University of Toronto, come there maybe once a month or whatnot. There's a group of them, and there were two standing there talking about one of these paintings, and one of the woman said, you know, I don't think genocide is the proper term to describe what happened. And I looked around, and I just looked, and then I looked back, and I sat there and I looked at the painting again. But this woman, you know, she came up to me and she says, I saw you look over. She says, and we, you know, what do you think of the term genocide? And so we got into a really interesting discussion. But one of the things that I realized out of that was that there is this feeling of, where do I start? Where do we start, right? Even now, after, you know, how many years? 7 years now since the Truth and Reconciliation found a report. And there's still that question out there, where do we start? So I think one of our biggest challenges then is creating a toolkit by Indigenous folks to say, you know, this is where we think you could start. Because as Marie Sinclair said, we can't do this ourselves. We can't. But there is lots of will. There is lots of allyship out there that needs to be enacted upon. And I think people have that, they just need to have the toolkit to show them, okay, this is where you start. And this goes for all different areas. It can go for healthcare, education, you know, everywhere. I think there are people that are there and willing. They just need to have some tools to start.
I will just pick up on the Kent Monkman show, and I want to just tell people it's a very powerful show, worth visiting. It's at the ROM, the Royal Ontario Museum, rather than at the art gallery. And it's there because he's kind of related some of the paintings to prehistoric times and the presence of Indigenous peoples in this land long before settlers came over. But I wonder, Kahente, if I think you can probably explain it briefly in a nutshell. Tell us about the show. As I recall it, as I would explain it, started with a kind of very fun kind of myth and celestial kind of interpretation of Indigenous thinking, and then moved into the reconciliation and the residential, or the rather residential schools. How would you explain it?
Well, I'd say that, you know, it's based on Cree tradition. It's based on reality, the reality of our history, the reality of our culture, the reality of our engagement with the natural world and all that's in it, including the stars, including the animals, including each other. And I think what happens is Kent Monkman takes inspiration from those ancient traditions and says, this is who we are, this is where we came from, and here's what I've created. This is a being that comes out of my imagination, but it also comes out of the reality of our Cree people's lived experiences. And so he creates this Miss Chief Eagle Testicle as a mythical being, but we have to remember that myth for us is not out of the ordinary. It is actually something very much grounded in reality. And so he's created this being that speaks to, you know, Indigenous Canada relations. It speaks to a lot of these issues that are coming up or that we have been discussing. And he brings them forward in a very, using a lot of Indigenous humor, but a lot of seriousness, a lot of heart. And it's a very powerful, powerful way to bring forward these issues so that you actually start to question, like those two women who were standing there.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's a very, and you know, part of what we need to be doing is reading the TRC report. But for those people who don't want to read a report, I think the Kent Monkman show is really powerful, and I really hope it travels across the country. And Kahente, you some months back, maybe almost a year ago, you did an interview with Michelle Good on her book, Five Little Indians. And I just want to highlight that for people who want to watch it. It's available on our YouTube channel, but it's another source of understanding the issues of Indigenous history and residential schools in a different kind of format if you don't feel like reading a report at this point. But I think these two artists have really helped us understand the issues very well. We've got a couple of questions in, and I just want to throw them at you. And the first was to share your thoughts about inflation and the cost of living. And maybe I'll ask you each just to comment on that briefly. I'll ask the professor from the business school to start. Jonathan, you go first and tell us how it's all going to end.
Oh, badly. No, it's look, it's and this is the complexity of the issues we're talking about. You know, why has inflation gone higher? Well, part of that is because Bank of Canada had to raise the rate to start to cool things off. And at what point does that balance out so they can drop the rate? And so inflation is a huge problem because we've already got a problem in terms of affordability, and our salaries are being worth less as costs go up. It's a very simple relationship. Linda, the negotiations that are occurring in various parts of Canada with the nurses and other unions to change wages don't do it by the same amount of inflation. So that also adds to that pressure to want to leave professions that are overworked and underpaid. So the longer this goes on, the more these other issues that we've been bringing up become bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. How does it end? You also have to remember we're part of a global economy. There's only a limited amount of stuff that the Canadian government can do to sway international trends. And although we're worse in many countries, this is an international trend. These are international problems that must be dealt with. So I realize that's not an optimistic answer, but I will tell you this too will pass. It always does. And hopefully, in this, we're grandparents, we're parents, we get this. Hopefully we're not going to hit the rates of the 70s.
Yeah. Thoughts on inflation, the cost of living, Linda?
Oh, I so wish we'd all be at a bargaining table. You know, bargaining is a supply and demand question, and that's why bargaining is so hot right now. And it's a problem for every union and every employer / government across the country. But like Jonathan said, it's a flash. Like we've seen waves going up and down, up and down. We've just been through almost 10 years of zeros, 0.5. You celebrate when you got a 1% wage increase. Well, the early 2000s, it was 10%, 12%, 15%. So very different. So we'll see how big the wave gets and give a few others headaches after that.
Yeah. Kahente, your thoughts on inflation and cost of living?
I think more on the ground in terms of my neighbor down the road or my mother in Gallant. You know, how does this impact people who are just getting by, right? I think the sovereignty issues of the Inuit in the north, right? The high cost of food and bringing the food up there. And then the reduced access to traditional foods, traditional lifeways. You know, like over the last 150 years, it comes and it goes up and it goes down, and we we sit tight in that rocking ship, in that rocking boat, in that rocking canoe until things settle down again.
Yeah.
That's my point of view.
Okay, thank you. Linda, next question for you. It's about masking. Can we just avoid masking and make it through?
No, no. I think we have a ethical, moral responsibilities as healthy citizens to protect those who are not healthy or those who have a potential of not being healthy. It's the same debate as staying home when you're sick. You know, we weren't thinking of myself. How many times did I go to work pre-COVID with the worst cold there was? I'd stay in my office, but I went on planes with the worst cold there was. I wouldn't do that today, but I need to go the extra step and wear my mask in public areas. I'm not talking if you're alone in the mall and there's not a cat around, or if you're walking outside, but in public areas, please wear your mask.
I asked my
Sorry, please go ahead.
I asked my students to use masks in the classroom, and I wear one. I brought it home for them. I said, I have an 82-year-old mother and a 2.5-year-old granddaughter, and I want to keep them safe. And I'd like it if you could help me do that. And so they wear the mask.
Yep.
Yeah.
And Kahente, this goes back to what I was saying earlier about Canadian values. That you don't wear a mask to save yourself, you wear a mask to help others. We can debate, and we have this polarization on COVID vaccine. Okay, that's fine. How in heaven's name do you have a debate or a lack of regard for wearing a mask? Forget COVID. How's about flu season, cold season? I'm immune compromised. My niece is immune compromised. My sister-in-law is immune compromised. Like, what in heaven's name are we doing when we argue about wearing a mask? I understand at the beginning when we couldn't find them. I get that, but that's not a problem anymore. So I turn back to Canadians and go, what is it we're all about again?
Yeah.
And why are we debating this?
Yeah. And at the beginning, the science wasn't as clear either. You know, they walked in COVID quasi-blind. I would say they shouldn't have been that blind because we had went through SARS and we knew about the precautionary principle. We knew when the science wasn't 100% sure, we needed to go back and protect airborne and touch. But now we know, you know, November 2022, we have no excuse. We know the science and we know the impact, the positive impact it does to our children, to our seniors, and the rest of us, and to our healthcare system. You know, all of us who get sick and don't have primary care and go to the emergency departments, that just makes the wait time for everything else skyrocket.
Yeah. Look, we've got one more question, and then I'll ask you each to sum up your thoughts about the urgent issues facing Canada. The last question is regarding trade, and I'll turn to you, Jonathan, for that. How do we make Canada more competitive in international trade?
Well, okay, in the end, this goes back to industries and markets and inflation. So the Canadian dollar has kind of been doing this, which, by the way, the lower it goes, the easier it is for us to trade. As we stabilize, it goes up, and that makes it more difficult. So this is a weird relationship. How do we become more competitive? I would say to the government, because we saw this with Nortel and BlackBerry, if there's industries that you think should be competitive globally, we got to support them. And if we don't support them in some way or shape, we lose credibility, which affects other industries as well. How do we become more globally competitive? Government is focused on innovation, and I have no problem with innovation. Unfortunately, their measures are wrong. The biggest thing these days is open innovation. By the way, that fits with Canadian culture. Why are we not encouraging Canadians that are innovative to team up with companies around the world or get the ideas from elsewhere? To say that you have to be value chain integrated in this day and age just doesn't make sense. Yet once again, that's the way it's evaluated. So there's a very big role for government to play. But the Canadian companies and, you know, Linda, back to we were talking about Atlantic Canada, the innovation rates I've seen out there are extraordinary. Newfoundland and Halifax with medical technology that is incredible. Why are we not recognizing this and helping them attain what should be happening globally?
Okay, as a wrap-up question then, 30 seconds to a minute each. What are the urgent issues you want us to be dealing with? I'll start with you, Linda, this time.
To keep the conversation going on. We need to break our silos and really have those hard discussions, but those respectful conversation. And it's like at bargaining. If you wait till you have a strike mandate to have a discussion at the bargaining table, it's too late.
Interesting way of looking at that. Yeah, thank you. Kahente, your thoughts?
Oh, I'd have to go along with what Linda's saying about continuing those respectful discussions and conversations, but also to think about the issues around food, ensuring that everybody has the right kind, the healthy foods on the table, because that goes a long way to also ensuring that there's less of us in those ERs, right? When we look after ourselves and we have access to the healthy stuff. Finding a way to make sure that everyone has equal access to.
Yeah. Thank you. And Jonathan, your thoughts, your last thought about the urgent.
Okay, I'm going to give the short answer and then slightly longer one. The short answer is please bring in Kahente. I mean, with all due respect, we have people with the tools, knowledge, skills, and history to try to get people to communicate more effectively. I think all three of us believe in that one. There was a Star Trek episode many, many years ago, the old version, where two warring factions are coming to the table with a phenomenal mediator. They each have their translators. The translators are killed. The Enterprise crew goes, I guess that's it for negotiations. And the mediator says, no, quite the opposite. Now they're going to have to come up with a common language and a way to communicate. And while they do that, they'll be developing a relationship. And that really, what you said, Kahente, what you said, Linda, brought me back to that Star Trek episode. So I think we're all on the same wavelength with what needs to be happening. And Andrew, this goes back to you. Pearson was set up not just to bring voices together, but to bring non-traditional voices together. Those people who were not traditionally listened to. And that's what we're talking about now. It's not just about the mainline talking. It's about bringing more people, more diverse groups together, which is what you created so many years ago.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for being part of this discussion. Professor Kahente Horn-Miller, President Linda Silas, and Professor Jonathan Calof, thank you for an important discussion as we start our mini fall conference on the urgent issues facing Canada. We want to tell our audiences that there are a couple of more sessions scheduled for this Friday and next Tuesday on healthcare and reconciliation that will take place on Friday and Tuesday. We've covered a lot of important topics today. We've gotten ourselves done by 1 o'clock on time. Thank you for joining us. Till the next time. Bye now.